Some things should never be touched. Some things should never be listened to. But the worst thing of all, some things should never be left behind. The village of Black Hollow was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, nestled deep in the woods, where no one came or left unless they had no choice. Its only notable feature, apart from the whispering trees, was Mrs. Pendergast, the old woman who lived at the edge of the village. The villagers didn't speak her name in public. They just called her the old woman with the spoon, as if her very presence was an ominous warning. She never left her house. In fact, no one had seen her leave it in over 30 years. It wasn't just her reclusiveness that frightened people. It was the spoon, the tarnished silver spoon that she carried with her everywhere. The spoon she never let go of, even as she shuffled through the dirt-streaked streets or sat at her window, watching the village like a hawk. The spoon was always in her hand, clutched so tightly that her knuckles were perpetually white. There were rumors, of course, rumors that sent a chill through even the bravest. People said Mrs. Pendergast had once been a beautiful woman, but her beauty faded when she lost her daughter, a little girl who had vanished without a trace years ago. They said the old woman used to stir her tea with that very spoon, murmuring to it as though it were alive, as though it could bring her daughter back. And then, one cold night, the spoon began to talk. It started softly, a faint, almost imperceptible tapping that could be heard from the cracks in her door. At first, the villagers dismissed it as nothing more than the wind. But as the tapping grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. It sounded like a spoon, like the faint tapping of silver on wood. But the rhythm wasn't natural. It was deliberate. Every night, it grew stronger, louder. Some nights, it would echo through the village like a twisted lullaby. One autumn evening, a brave young man named Thomas, new to the village, grew tired of the whispered warnings and dared to seek out the truth. He'd heard the rumors, of course, but he wasn't afraid. The villagers' stories were just that, stories. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He knocked on the crooked door of Mrs. Pendergast's house, the air thick with an unexplainable unease. The door creaked open slowly, revealing her pale face in the dim light of the doorway. Her eyes were dark, sunken, as though they had been hollowed out by years of sorrow and sleepless nights. She stared at him, unblinking, with an unsettling silence. "Can I help you, young man?" Her voice was thin and cracked, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. Thomas, forcing his nerves down, asked, "I've been hearing strange things. Tapping noises coming from your house. What's going on here?" She looked at him for a long moment, the air thickening with something sinister. Finally, she spoke. "The spoon," she whispered, as though it were the most important thing in the world. "Just the spoon?" Thomas asked, still not entirely convinced. "Yes, the spoon," she repeated, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "My daughter, she talks through it." Before he could respond, she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. He hesitated, but curiosity gnawed at him. He stepped inside, the air inside the house stale and thick with a foul scent, like something had died years ago and never been properly buried. The inside of the house was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering candle on a table covered in dust. Mrs. Pendergast led him to the table, where the spoon sat, gleaming strangely in the weak light. "This," she said, her voice trembling, "was my daughter's." She picked up the spoon, and the moment she did, the air shifted. The tapping started again, louder now, sharp, erratic, almost like frantic banging. It was as if the spoon was alive, trying to escape her grip. "No!" she hissed, clutching it harder. "Not yet! She's not ready yet! Not yet!" Thomas stepped back, his heart racing as the spoon began to rattle violently in her hands. The tapping grew to a deafening roar, and he could feel the air turning heavy, thick, oppressive, as if something was pushing against his chest. Suddenly, Mrs. Pendergast's expression twisted into something unrecognizable. Her mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin, far too wide to be natural. Her teeth yellowed and sharp like animal fangs. Her eyes glowed faintly, not with the warmth of life, but with something else. A hunger. "That spoon," she whispered, her voice now low and guttural. "It's her. She's coming back. You shouldn't have come here, Thomas." Before he could react, the spoon flew from her hands, spinning through the air with an unnatural force. It hovered for a moment, tapping the walls, the table, the floor, as though searching for something. The sound it made wasn't normal. It was like fingernails scratching down a blackboard. A shrill, bone-chilling sound that made his body freeze. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The room was silent, dead silent. Thomas looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His pulse raced in his ears. His breath came in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. So wrong. And then he heard it. A voice. A soft whisper, coming from the spoon. It wasn't Mrs. Pendergast's voice, but the voice of a child, high-pitched and fragile. "Help me. Come closer." His stomach twisted, and he felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. It was her voice, the missing daughter. But there was something wrong, something so deeply wrong about the way it sounded. The voice was too hollow, too distant, and it was calling him. Before he could move, the spoon shot across the room and lodged itself in his chest with a sickening thud. The pain was instant, sharp and burning, as if the spoon had driven itself into his heart. Mrs. Pendergast's shriek filled the room, and in that moment, the world around him went dark. When the villagers found Thomas the next morning, his body was lying in the dirt outside her house, his eyes wide open in an expression of pure terror. Clutched tightly in his hand was the old spoon, its surface now gleaming with fresh, dark stains. And from inside the house, the tapping began again. Louder, sharper, more frantic than ever before. Mrs. Pendergast was gone, but the spoon was still there. And every night, the tapping continued, calling out for someone else to come, someone else to listen.